Victorian England loved calling itself civilized. But in reality, daily life was a silent horror game where one wrong look, one wrong word, or one wrong step could socially execute you on the spot. This video isn't about fancy dresses or polite tea parties. It's about 44 real etiquette rules that punished normal human behavior and turned existing into a full-time performance. By the end of this, you'll realize modern society isn't chaotic. It's merciful. 1. Walking down a street in Victorian London was honestly more stressful than defusing a bomb because of a little nightmare called the cut direct. This was a social sniper shot where a lady could destroy a man purely by staring at his face. If you were a guy, you had to walk around like a frightened puppy, waiting for a lady to bow to you first, because if you tipped your hat too early, you were basically a criminal. But the real kicker was when she looked right at you and did absolutely nothing. That silence was louder than a cannon blast. It told every single person on the sidewalk that you were absolute garbage and had been deleted from existence. You could be best friends yesterday, but today, you are a ghost just because you wore the wrong tie or sneezed at a tea party. Men spent their whole lives terrified of making eye contact because one blank stare meant their social life was officially toilet paper. 2. Pineapples were so expensive and trendy that people who could not afford one would actually rent a pineapple for the night just to show off. You would pay a shopkeeper to borrow the fruit for your dinner party and put it in the center of the table as a status symbol. The catch was that nobody was allowed to eat it because you had to return it the next morning. It is essentially the same as renting a Ferrari to park in your driveway but never driving it. Guests would sit there admiring the spiky fruit, thinking the host was incredibly wealthy, while the host was terrified that someone might accidentally slice into his security deposit. It is hilarious that a piece of rotting fruit was a bigger flex than gold jewelry. 3. Doctors actually invented a fake medical condition called bicycle face to scare ladies away from pedaling because they were terrified of women having mobility. They claimed that the strain of balancing on two wheels would cause a woman's eyes to bulge out and her jaw to clench permanently, making her look terrifying. It was basically a lie invented by men who were scared that women could now travel fast enough to run away from them. Imagine telling your daughter she cannot ride a bike because the wind will freeze her face into a hideous monster mask. They were terrified of any activity that gave women freedom, so they just made up ridiculous medical symptoms to keep them walking. 4. Giving gifts to your friends was a horror movie nightmare because the most popular present was jewelry made out of your own hair. I am not joking. People would literally cut off locks of their hair and weave them into bracelets or necklaces to give to loved ones. It was considered the ultimate sign of affection to wear a piece of someone else's body around your wrist. Imagine if your buddy handed you a bracelet today and told you he made it out of his own ponytail. You would call the police. But for the Victorians, braiding dead human hair into complicated patterns was just a cute Tuesday afternoon craft project that everyone did. E5. You would think a library is a safe place for quiet reading, but apparently it was a hotbed of scandalous paper romance according to some insane etiquette guides. There was a genuine rule suggesting that books written by male authors could not be placed next to books by female authors on a shelf unless the authors were actually married in real life. Someone genuinely believed that if you put a book by Charles Dickens next to one by Jane Austen, the pages would somehow get too cozy when the lights went out. They treated dusty old hardcovers like teenagers with raging hormones who could not be trusted to stand next to each other. Imagine organizing your entire bookshelf based on the fear that a biography of George Washington might try to flirt with a cookbook just because they were touching spines. 6. The Victorians acted like seeing a female ankle was the same thing as seeing an alien landing because they treated staircases like military danger zones. A gentleman could absolutely never walk behind a lady up the stairs because his eyes might accidentally drift downward and catch a glimpse of her heel, which would obviously make his brain explode. But he also could not walk in front of her because that was considered rude. So the poor guy had to walk beside her while awkwardly hugging the wall or just wait at the bottom until she was safely on the next floor. They turned a simple act of climbing wooden steps into a logistical nightmare to prevent men from going into a frenzy over a specific bone in the foot. 7. Dinner parties were basically a minefield where saying the wrong anatomical word could get you exiled from the neighborhood forever. You were absolutely forbidden from saying the word leg at the table because it reminded people that chickens actually had bodies, and that was just too much reality to handle. If you wanted a drumstick, you had to ask for the dark meat or some other ridiculous code word to keep everyone from fainting into their soup. It got so bad that people started using goofy euphemisms for everything just to avoid admitting that humans and animals have limbs. You sat there sweating in your tight collar, trying to navigate a secret language just to get some protein on your plate. 8. Dating in this era was less about romance and more about avoiding an accidental marriage lawsuit because being alone was illegal. If a man and a woman were left in a room with the door closed for even 15 minutes, society just assumed they were engaged. There was no such thing as just hanging out or having a chat because the Victorians assumed everyone had zero self-control. You had to have a chaperone hovering over you constantly like a human security camera to ensure no hand-holding occurred. If a fire broke out and you saved a girl by carrying her out of a burning building, you might actually be obligated to propose to her afterwards because you touched her without a formal introduction. 9. The color green was the hottest fashion trend of the era, but the dye was made with massive amounts of arsenic, which is a deadly poison. Women were walking around in emerald green dresses that were literally slowly killing them and everyone around them. The fabric would shed toxic dust into the ballroom, making people dizzy and sick, but nobody cared because the color popped. They loved the aesthetic so much that they ignored the fact that their clothes were chemical weapons. It is the ultimate example of being a slave to fashion where looking trendy was considered more important than keeping your internal organs functioning properly. 10. Fashion turned women into walking obstacles thanks to a ridiculous invention called the crinoline, which was basically a giant steel cage under a dress. These hoop skirts were so massive that a woman could take up 6 feet of space just by standing there. Walking through a doorway was a geometry puzzle because you had to turn sideways and shimmy through like a crab. If a lady turned around too fast in a crowded room, she would knock over vases, teacups, and probably a small child like a human wrecking ball. It made simple things impossible because you could not even get close enough to a dinner table to eat without your skirt hitting the edge. It was not just clothing, it was a personal force field that kept the entire world 5 feet away from you. 11. Men were so obsessed with their massive facial hair that they literally reinvented dinnerware to protect their precious whiskers. The mustache cup was a genuine invention that featured a weird little ceramic ledge inside the mug to keep the liquid away from the hair. It was designed because having a wet mustache was considered gross and ungentlemanly at the tea table. Imagine being such a delicate flower that you need a dam built inside your coffee cup just so your upper lip does not get damp. They treated their facial hair like a sacred national monument that had to be protected from the terrifying threat of Earl Grey tea. It is hilarious that they could conquer empires but fell apart if they got a little bit of foam in their beard. 12. Queen Victoria basically destroyed the beauty industry because she decided that wearing makeup was something only actors and criminals did. A respectable lady was absolutely forbidden from using rouge or lipstick unless she wanted people to think she had loose morals. But women still wanted to look good, so they resorted to literal self-harm to get a glow. Instead of applying blush, they would violently pinch their own cheeks until the skin was raw and red. They would bite their lips over and over again to make them look pink and swollen. Imagine getting ready for a hot date by punching yourself in the face just to get some color. It implies that being in physical pain was perfectly fine, but using a little bit of powder from a jar was a sin against nature. 13. Going to the beach involved a ridiculous wooden contraption called a bathing machine because walking into the ocean was too scandalous. You could not just run into the waves in your swimsuit because people might see your human shape. Instead, you had to step into a small wooden shed on wheels that was parked on the sand. Then, a horse would drag the entire shed into the water with you inside it. You would open the door on the ocean side and hop in, so that nobody on the beach could see you. It implies that the sight of a wet person was so dangerous to society that you needed a horse-drawn dressing room just to take a dip. 14. Sending a letter was not just about mailing a bill, it was a secret code system that would make a spy dizzy. The angle at which you placed the postage stamp on the envelope carried a hidden romantic message that the postman probably laughed at. If you put the stamp upside down in the corner, it meant "I love you," but if you put it sideways, It might mean I hate you or goodbye forever. People were obsessively checking the corners of their mail, like detectives trying to solve a murder case. You could accidentally propose marriage to your landlord just because you were sloppy when you licked the stamp. It turns the boring act of mailing a letter into a high-stakes emotional roller coaster, where one tilted picture of the Queen could ruin your love life. 15. Walking on the sidewalk was a tactical mission, where the man had to act as a human shield against flying horse poop. The strict rule was that a gentleman always walked on the side of the pavement closest to the street. This was not just to look cool, it was because horse-drawn carriages were constantly splashing mud and filth everywhere as they drove by. The man was literally expected to use his fancy coat to block waves of brown sludge from hitting the lady's dress. If he switched sides and let the lady walk near the curb, people would look at him like he was a monster who hated women. Basically, your job as a boyfriend was to be a biological mud flap to keep her gown clean while you got covered in mystery street liquid. 16. You could attend a party with 100 people and stand in total silence because talking to a stranger was strictly forbidden without a middleman. You were not allowed to just walk up to someone and say hello, because that was seen as aggressive and rude. You had to find a mutual friend to formally introduce you first. If you were standing next to someone at the buffet table and the house caught on fire, you technically needed an introduction before you could tell them to run. People would literally stand awkwardly next to each other for hours staring at the wall because nobody had come over to say the magic words that allowed them to speak. 17. Shaking hands was a high-speed dexterity test for men, because touching a lady with a gloved hand was a major insult. If a lady offered her hand to you on the street, you had to rip your right glove off instantly before touching her skin. It had to be a smooth motion, like drawing a sword from a scabbard. If your glove was too tight or stuck, you had to panic and apologize profusely while shaking her hand with the glove still on. It turned a simple greeting into a frantic struggle with your own clothing. Walking around town was just a constant anxiety attack about whether your gloves were loose enough to be polite or if you would look like a fool. 18. Drinking tea sounds like the easiest thing in the world, but for the Victorians, it was a high-stakes acoustic challenge that could ruin your reputation. The absolute golden rule was that your teaspoon had to be totally silent like a metal ninja inside the china cup. If you stirred your sugar and the spoon made a clinking noise against the side of the cup, everyone looked at you like you were banging pots and pans in a library. And do not even think about leaving the spoon in the cup while you sip, because that was considered a physical hazard. They genuinely believed that if you drank with the spoon inside, you would poke your own eye out or look like a toddler who does not know how gravity works. 19. If you think modern FOMO is bad, try the Victorian mourning rules, which were basically a social prison sentence. Thanks to Queen Victoria, grieving was a competitive sport where widows had to wear non-reflective black crepe for 2 solid years. This was not just about looking sad. The fabric was itchy, smelled bad, and notoriously bled dye onto your skin, literally marking you with grief. During this time, you could not attend parties, dance, or have fun, essentially pausing your life while everyone else kept partying. And if you were a man, you just slapped a black band on your hat and carried on as usual. It was a massive industry of misery designed to make sure women stayed miserable and commercially viable consumers of jet jewelry. 20. Sitting in a chair seems like a time to relax, but for a Victorian lady, it was an endurance test for her spine muscles. The rule was that a proper lady must never ever let her back touch the back of the chair. You had to sit bolt upright at a 90-degree angle, as if there was an invisible spike waiting to stab you if you leaned back. Lounging or slouching was seen as a sign of loose morals and laziness, so they sat on the edge of their seats for hours like human statues. Imagine going to a 3-hour dinner party and having to hold your upper body perfectly still without any support while wearing a corset that is already crushing your ribs. 21. Smoking a cigar was treated like handling nuclear waste because the smell was considered fatal to a lady's delicate nose. If a man wanted to smoke, he could not just light up, he had to retreat to a special soundproof room with thick walls. But here's the crazy part. He had to put on a specific outfit called a smoking jacket and a special cap to catch the smoke. This was basically a hazmat suit designed to keep the tobacco smell from sticking to his regular clothes. After he finished, he had to change back into his normal suit and scrub himself down before he was allowed to go near women again. They acted like cigar smoke was a contagious disease that would instantly wither any female who caught a whiff of it from 3 rooms away. 22. Sending flowers to a girl was not a romantic gesture, it was a botanical minefield where a single wrong petal could start a war. They had this insane code called the language of flowers, where every single plant had a specific translation. A red rose meant love, but a yellow rose meant, I am jealous and I hate you. If you accidentally put a marigold in a bouquet, you were telling the girl she was grief-stricken and miserable. Guys had to carry around pocket guidebooks to make sure they were not accidentally insulting their crush with a daisy. Imagine trying to be nice and buying a mixed bouquet, only to find out you just told a girl that she is arrogant and her feet smell because you picked the wrong color carnation. 23. Visiting your friends sounds like fun, but in this era, it was a timed military operation that would give anyone a panic attack. You were strictly allowed to visit only during specific afternoon hours, and the golden rule was that you could not stay longer than 15 minutes. If you stayed for 20 minutes, you were considered a rude freeloader who did not know when to leave. You had to sit there with your hat on, making boring small talk while secretly watching the clock ticking down. It was essentially speed dating, but with your boring neighbors and terrible tea. If you overstayed your welcome, the hostess would just freeze you out until you got the hint and ran for the door. 24. Being a kid in Victorian times was like being a piece of furniture because of the strict rule that children should be seen and not heard. Kids were expected to be silent statues who only existed in the background of adult lives. You could be in the room with your parents, but you were absolutely forbidden from speaking unless an adult asked you a direct question first. If you laughed too loud or cried or tried to play a game, you were instantly banished to the nursery on the top floor. Parents basically wanted the cute aesthetic of having a family without the annoyance of actually interacting with them until they turned 21. 25. Laughing out loud was considered a sign of low intelligence and a total lack of self-control, so parties were painfully quiet. A gentleman was only allowed to give a polite smile, and a lady could maybe release a tiny silent giggle behind her fan. A real belly laugh was seen as animalistic behavior that made you look like a drunk peasant. Imagine hearing the funniest joke of your life and having to swallow your laughter until you choke just to look polite. It turned every dinner party into a torture chamber where showing actual happiness or personality was the quickest way to get deleted from the guest list. 26. Using someone's first name was practically a crime, and it was easier to break into a bank than to get on a first-name basis with a Victorian. The rules were so stiff that using a first name was considered an intimate act almost on the same level as kissing. You could know someone for 20 years and still have to call them Mr. Smith, or you were being tragically rude. It gets even weirder because this applied to married couples too. In public, a wife was expected to refer to her own husband as Mr. Jones rather than Tom to maintain dignity. It sounds like a business partnership instead of a marriage. Imagine waking up next to someone every day for 40 years and still calling them by their last name at the breakfast table like you are casual acquaintances meeting for a job interview. 27. Sundays were legally designed to be the most boring day in human history because having fun was considered a sin against God. The strict religious rules meant that you were absolutely forbidden from playing games, running around, or even whistling a happy tune. Kids had their toys locked away in a cupboard and were forced to read heavy religious books or just sit in silence for hours staring at the wall. If a child tried to play with a doll or roll a hoop outside, the neighbors would look at the parents like they were raising wild heathens. God apparently hated laughter and joy, so the entire country turned into a silent library where you could not even sneeze too loud without offending the heavens. 28. The ballroom sounds fun, but it was actually a trap because of a terrifying rule about refusing a dance partner. If a guy you absolutely hated asked you to dance, and you said no, you were legally banned from dancing with anyone else for the rest of the night. You could not just say no to the creep and wait for the cute guy to show up later. Once you rejected the sweaty guy with the bad breath, you had to sit on the sidelines like a statue while everyone else had fun. It was a social hostage situation where You either had to dance with a loser or spend the entire evening glued to a chair, punishing yourself for simply having standards. 29. Money was considered so filthy and vulgar that a proper lady was never supposed to carry it or even touch it with her bare hands. The idea was that commerce and coins were dirty male things that would corrupt a woman's delicate nature. If a lady went shopping, she would just point at things and have them sent to her house, so her husband or father could pay the bill later. She walked around town completely broke, not because she was poor, but because holding a coin was seen as gross manual labor. It is hilarious that they thought a tiny metal disc was too heavy and sinful for a woman, but she was walking around wearing a corset made of steel and whalebone that crushed her internal organs. 30. Carving the Sunday roast chicken was not just cooking, it was a high-pressure performance art starring the father of the house. The head of the household had to carve the meat right at the table in front of everyone, and if he messed it up, he was a failure as a man. He had to slice it perfectly thin without splashing gravy or hacking the bird to pieces while 12 hungry people stared at him in silence. There were actual guidebooks written just to teach men how to dissect a duck gracefully without looking like a butcher. If a guy struggled with the knife or dropped a wing on the tablecloth, he looked incompetent and weak. It turned a simple family dinner into a surgical exam where the dad was sweating bullets over a dead turkey. 31. Fashion in the Victorian era was not just a hobby, it was a full-time job that required the stamina of a marathon runner. A wealthy lady was expected to change her outfit up to 7 times a single day just to prove she had money. She needed a morning dress for breakfast, a walking dress for strolling, a carriage dress for sitting in a wagon, and a tea gown for snacks. It implies that these women spent 90% of their waking hours half-naked in a dressing room struggling with buttons and hooks. You could not just wear your comfortable leggings all day, you had to strap yourself into a new steel cage every 2 hours just to walk from the living room to the dining room. 32. Ladies were so obsessed with having a tiny mouth that they literally practiced a vocal workout to freeze their face into a specific shape. Before entering a room, a girl would recite a ridiculous phrase like prunes and prisms over and over again to purse her lips. The goal was to make your mouth look like a tiny rosebud, because apparently having a regular human mouth that could eat food was considered too large and aggressive. They walked around whispering about fruit and geometry just to force their facial muscles into a permanent pout. It implies that the most attractive thing a woman could do was look like she was trying to suck a lemon while refusing to speak clearly. 33. Men had to have the arm strength of a bodybuilder just to walk down the street because of the insane hat-tipping rules. A gentleman was required to lift his hat completely off his head every single time he saw a lady he knew. If he walked down a busy street and passed 20 women, he had to take his hat off and put it back on 20 times in a row. It was a repetitive arm workout that probably caused shoulder injuries. And he could not just touch the brim like a cool cowboy, he had to lift it high enough to show respect. It implies that a man's head had to be constantly exposed to the elements, just to prove he was not a savage. 34. Making conversation at a dinner party was the most boring activity on earth because almost every interesting topic was banned. You were strictly forbidden from talking about politics, religion, money, or anything that might cause a tiny disagreement. This meant that for 3 hours you were forced to talk about the weather, and absolutely nothing else. You would sit there eating dry mutton while passionately discussing the chance of rain, just to avoid an awkward silence. If you tried to bring up a news story or a book, everyone would panic and look at you like you just threw a grenade on the table. They essentially turned social interaction into a contest of who could say the most meaningless sentences without falling asleep. 35. Crossing the street was a financial transaction because ladies refused to let their shoes touch the dirty ground. There were actual guys called crossing sweepers who stood on corners with brooms waiting for rich people to show up. A lady would pay the sweeper a coin to frantically brush away the horse poop and mud in front of her as she walked. She would march across the street like royalty, while a guy cleared a path for her feet in real time. It is hilarious to think that these women were so fancy they believed the earth itself was too dirty for their boots. They walked through the city with a personal human bulldozer just to avoid a speck of dirt on their hem. 36. Since they could not have real fun, the Victorians became obsessed with ferns, to a level that can only be described as a mental illness. This craze was called pterodomania, and it meant that everyone went crazy collecting leafy green plants. People would travel for miles to hunt for a rare fern in the woods, and then display it in a glass case like a trophy. Watching a plant sit in a glass box was considered peak entertainment for a Friday night. They treated these boring green weeds like they were rock stars or rare diamonds. It tells you everything you need to know about their boredom that a pot of immobile leaves was the most exciting thing happening in their lives. 37. Flirting in a ballroom was not about words. It was a high-stakes game of secret tactical signals using a hand fan. Since talking about feelings was considered gross, women developed an encrypted code where every movement of the fan meant something specific. Placing the fan near the heart meant, "You have won my love," but fanning slowly meant, "I am married, so go away." If a lady twirled the fan in her left hand, she was warning you that you were being watched by her parents. Men had to memorize this ridiculous semaphore language just to figure out if a girl liked them. Imagine trying to date someone who only communicates by waving a stick, and if you misinterpret a wrist flick, you accidentally agree to marry her. 38. Eating fruit at a dinner party was not a snack. It was a surgical operation that required a medical degree to perform correctly. You were absolutely forbidden from biting into an apple or a pear with your teeth because that looked like animal behavior. You had to peel the fruit with a knife and fork while holding it down on your plate without touching it with your fingers. If the pear slipped and flew across the table, you were socially dead. Imagine trying to dissect a slippery peach with silver tools while wearing white gloves and trying to look elegant. They took the simplest food in nature and turned it into a high-stress dexterity test just to prove they were not monkeys. 39. Fainting was not always a medical emergency. It was often a calculated tactical move to get out of an awkward conversation. Women wore corsets that restricted their breathing, but they also used the swoon as a social weapon. If a man said something rude or the topic got too boring, a lady could just gracefully collapse onto a sofa and end the interaction instantly. It was the Victorian equivalent of pretending your phone battery died, but much more dramatic. Every house had a special fainting couch designed specifically for this moment. It implies that women were so bored by these stiff men that they preferred to temporarily lose consciousness rather than listen to another sentence. 40. A walking stick was absolutely not for walking, and if you used it to support your weight, you were doing it wrong. For a young gentleman, a cane was purely a fashion accessory that had to be carried with a specific swagger. You were supposed to tuck it under your arm or twirl it casually, but never actually lean on it like an old man. If the cane touched the ground too often, people thought you were physically weak or injured. It is hilarious that they carried around a sturdy wooden stick all day but had to pretend it was as light as a feather. Basically, it was a glorified fidget spinner made of expensive wood that you had to lug around just to look cool. 41. Young ladies were forced to learn the piano, but there was a bizarre rule that they must not play too well. If a girl played the piano with too much skill or passion, she looked like a professional musician, which was considered a lower-class job. The goal was to be mediocre enough to entertain guests, but not talented enough to look like you actually worked hard at it. Parents wanted their daughters to be aggressively average at music. Imagine practicing an instrument for years, only to be told that you need to miss a few notes on purpose so you do not look like someone who needs to earn a paycheck. 42. Being single at the age of 25 was considered a catastrophic failure that basically ended your life. If a woman reached her mid-20s without a husband, she was officially labeled an old maid, and society gave up on her. She was expected to start wearing boring clothes and stop having fun because her time on the market had expired. It is insane that they treated women like cartons of milk with a visible expiration date. You could be a vibrant, healthy 26-year-old, but in their eyes, you were a dusty antique that belonged in the attic. The pressure to marry the first guy who asked was overwhelming because the alternative was becoming a social ghost. 43. The obsession with silverware got so out of hand that they invented a specific fork for almost every single food item in existence. There were sardine forks, berry spoons, asparagus tongs, and specialized knives just for cheese. A formal dinner table looked like a terrifying display of surgical equipment with dozens of metal tools surrounding the plate. Guests lived in constant fear of using the cucumber server to pick up a tomato, which would obviously make them look like an uneducated peasant. They complicated eating so much that you practically needed a user manual just to get a piece of fish from the plate to your mouth without causing a scandal. 44. The debutante ball was the grand finale of etiquette hell, where teenage girls were presented to the queen like prize cattle at a state fair. Young ladies spent months learning how to walk and bow just for a 30-second inspection by the monarch. They had to wear massive white dresses with feathers and drag a long, heavy train behind them without tripping. It was basically a high-stakes meat market where mothers tried to auction off their daughters to the richest man in the room. The entire social season was just a competitive shopping spree for husbands, where human beings were the merchandise and the price tag was their dowry. Be honest. Which single rule would have gotten you socially erased first? Not annoyed, not uncomfortable, ruined. Name it, defend it, and try not to lie to yourself in the comments. If this made Victorian high society feel more insane than impressive, hit like. Subscribe. Because history gets way worse than they taught you.